Frank stepped forward, holding a manila envelope. "Sandra, I think you should see this." He pulled out photographs and appraisal documentation. "These photos show you personally throwing away a Japanese netsuke worth approximately $900,000. The appraiser who originally evaluated this piece in 1987 has provided sworn testimony about its authenticity and value." Sandra stared at the photos, her face cycling through shock, calculation, and finally desperate anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove that little wooden thing was worth anything." That's when Michael spoke up. "Sandra, I found Uncle Harry's war records. You told everyone he was too young to serve in World War II, but his discharge papers show he enlisted in 1942. You were completely wrong about basic family history." For the first time since I'd known her, Sandra had nothing to say. I walked into what used to be my workshop and froze. 27 years of memories, tools, and treasures were gone. Just gone. The shelves where I'd carefully organized decades of collectibles, my father's old radio, my military medals, even the wooden box my grandfather carved by hand, everything had vanished. In their place sat a brand new exercise bike with a bright red bow. "Surprise, Dad," my son Michael called out, appearing behind me with his wife Sandra. "We cleaned out all that old junk and got you something useful instead. Sandra thought you needed to get more active at your age." Sandra stood there with her arms crossed, wearing that smug expression she always had when she thought she was being helpful. "Honestly, Dad," she said, using that patronizing tone she'd perfected, "you're 72. It's time to let go of all that clutter. Most of it was just taking up space anyway." My hands started shaking, not from age but from rage I'd never felt before. "Where is everything?" I managed to ask, my voice barely steady. "Where are my things?" "Gone to the dump this morning," Sandra announced proudly. "I organized the whole thing. Took 3 trips with Michael's truck, but we got it all out. The room looks so much better now, don't you think?" I stared at the empty shelves, the bare walls where my father's Purple Heart had hung for decades, the corner where I'd kept my collection of vintage baseball cards, including the 1952 Mickey Mantle rookie card I'd bought for 50 cents when I was 12 years old, the old trunk that held my late wife's jewelry and love letters. All of it, gone. "You threw away Martha's jewelry?" I whispered, referring to my deceased wife of 43 years. "Oh, that old costume stuff." Sandra waved her hand dismissively. "Dad, it was all tarnished and broken. I kept 1 or 2 pieces that looked decent, but the rest was just worthless trinkets. You can't hold on to everything forever." Michael shifted uncomfortably beside his wife, finally sensing something was wrong. "Dad, we thought you'd appreciate the gesture. Sandra spent all weekend organizing this." That's when it hit me. They had no idea what they'd done. No idea that among all that junk was something worth more than their house, their cars, and probably their entire net worth combined. The small, unassuming wooden figurine I'd inherited from my uncle, the one Sandra probably dismissed as another worthless trinket, was actually an authentic Edo period netsuke my uncle had acquired in Japan during World War II. I'd had it appraised years ago, quietly, without telling anyone. The appraiser's hands had trembled as he examined it, confirming it was worth nearly $800,000. But as I stood there, looking at their expectant faces waiting for gratitude, I realized something even more devastating. They didn't just throw away my possessions. They threw away my history, my memories, my connection to everyone I'd ever loved, and they expected me to thank them for it. The real humiliation came 3 days later at Michael's birthday barbecue. Sandra had invited half the neighborhood, making sure everyone could see their home improvement project and hear about how they'd helped poor Dad declutter his life. I arrived to find Sandra giving tours of my old workshop, now transformed into what she called her wellness room. The exercise bike sat prominently in the center, surrounded by yoga mats and motivational posters she'd hung where my father's war memorabilia used to be displayed. "You should have seen the state of this place before," Sandra announced to a group of neighbors, her voice carrying that theatrical tone she used when she wanted attention. Honestly, it was like an episode of that hoarding show. Poor Dad had accumulated decades of absolute junk in here. Broken radios, rusty tools, boxes of old papers. I'm not exaggerating when I say it took us 6 hours just to haul it all to the dump. Mrs. Peterson from across the street nodded sympathetically. "Oh, you're such a good daughter-in-law, Sandra. It must have been overwhelming dealing with all that mess." "It really was," Sandra continued, warming to her audience. "But someone had to take charge. Dad's been living in the past for too long. At his age, he needs to focus on his health, not hoarding worthless trinkets." I stood in the doorway, invisible to them, listening to my life being reduced to a burden they'd heroically lifted. My throat felt tight as I watched Sandra demonstrate the exercise bike to the gathered crowd, explaining how she'd finally gotten Dad to embrace a healthier lifestyle. When I finally entered the room, the conversation stopped abruptly. Sandra turned to me with that bright, fake smile she reserved for public moments. "Dad, come show everyone your new exercise bike." Tell them how much you love the fresh, clean space we created for you." All eyes turned to me. The neighbors smiled expectantly, waiting for my grateful response to my family's thoughtfulness. I could see the narrative Sandra had constructed playing out perfectly in their minds. The elderly widower too stuck in his ways to help himself, saved by his caring daughter-in-law's intervention. "Actually," I said quietly, "I'd like to know more about what specifically you threw away. Could we talk privately?" Sandra's smile flickered for just a moment before she recovered. "Oh, Dad, we're not going to relitigate the spring cleaning project again, are we? Everyone here can see how much better the space looks now." "I just want to know about a few specific items," I insisted, feeling the weight of everyone's stares. There were some things that had sentimental value. "Sentimental value?" Sandra laughed and several neighbors chuckled along with her. "Dad, you said that about everything. The broken clock radio had sentimental value. The box of random buttons had sentimental value. At some point you have to be practical." Michael appeared beside his wife, clearly uncomfortable with the public nature of our conversation. "Dad, maybe we should discuss this later." But Sandra was on a roll now, playing to her audience. "No, it's fine, Michael. Dad needs to hear this from people who care about him." She turned to address the room. "Sometimes when we get older we attach emotional significance to objects that really don't matter. It becomes unhealthy. Dad was holding on to things just because they were old, not because they had any real value." The neighbors nodded knowingly. I could see the pity in their eyes, the way they looked at me as if I were a confused old man who couldn't distinguish between treasure and trash. Sandra had masterfully painted me as someone who needed their patience and understanding, not their respect. "There was a small wooden figurine," I said, my voice growing smaller under their collective gaze. "About 3 inches tall, Japanese. Did you happen to notice it?" Sandra rolled her eyes. "Dad, there were dozens of little knickknacks. I couldn't possibly remember every single piece of clutter we cleared out." The shame burned in my chest as I realized what was happening. I wasn't just being dismissed, I was being publicly diagnosed as a hoarder, a burden, a man whose judgment couldn't be trusted, and the worst part was, everyone in that room believed her story completely. That night, I sat alone in my empty workshop and let my mind drift back to everything I'd given up for this family. Everything Sandra had just dismissed as the ramblings of a sentimental old man. I thought about 1987, when Michael was 17 and desperately wanted to go to college. State University was all we could afford on my machinist's salary, but Michael had his heart set on the expensive private school that had accepted him. "It's my dream school, Dad," he'd said, tears in his eyes. "Please." Martha and I stayed up all night talking about it. We looked at our savings, our retirement fund, everything we'd scraped together over 20 years of marriage. It wasn't enough, not even close. That's when I remembered Uncle Harry's gift sitting in my workshop, the small wooden figurine he'd brought back from Japan. He'd told me it might be valuable someday, but I'd never had it properly appraised. I drove to the antique dealer downtown, my hands sweating on the steering wheel. When the appraiser examined that little 3-inch netsuke under his magnifying glass, his eyes widened. "Sir," he said quietly, "this is authentic Edo period, probably early 1800s. In today's market, you're looking at somewhere between $600,000 and $800,000. I nearly fell off my chair. We were rich. Michael could go to any school he wanted. Martha could quit her exhausting job at the diner. We could travel, buy a bigger house, live the life we'd only dreamed about, but I never sold it. Instead, I took out a second mortgage on our house. I worked double shifts at the factory, pulling 16-hour days until my back screamed and my hands cramped. I took a weekend job doing repairs for neighbors. Martha picked up extra shifts waitressing, coming home so tired she could barely stand. For 4 years, we scraped and saved and sacrificed everything to pay for Michael's education. I remember the graduation day when Michael walked across that stage. Martha squeezed my hand and whispered, "We did it, Robert. Our boy's gonna have a better life than we did." I could have told her then about the figurine, about how I could have paid for everything with one simple transaction, but something held me back. Maybe it was pride. Maybe it was the knowledge that working for something makes it more valuable than just having it handed to you. Then came 1995. Martha's cancer diagnosis hit us like a freight train. Stage 3 breast cancer. Aggressive treatment needed immediately. Our insurance covered the basics, but the experimental treatments her doctor recommended, the ones that might save her life, those weren't covered. We needed $40,000, and we needed it fast. Again I looked at that little figurine. Again I chose the harder path. I sold my truck and bought a beat-up Honda. I sold my tools, my baseball card collection, everything I owned of value except that one wooden treasure. I borrowed against my life insurance. I took loans from family members, swallowing my pride to beg my brother for money. We refinanced the house again, stretching our payments to the breaking point. Martha went through 18 months of hell. Chemotherapy, radiation, surgery, more chemo. I held her hand through every appointment, every sleepless night when the pain was too much to bear. We fought that cancer with everything we had, and we won. She lived 15 more beautiful years, long enough to see Michael marry Sandra, long enough to hold her first grandchild. When Martha died in 2010, peaceful in her sleep, I finally understood why I'd never sold that figurine. It wasn't about the money. It was about proving to myself that I could take care of my family without taking the easy way out, that I was strong enough, capable enough, worthy enough to earn what we needed through my own sweat and determination. Every sacrifice I made, every extra shift I worked, every payment I stretched to make, it all meant something. It meant I was a provider, a protector, a man who could be counted on when times got tough. That figurine wasn't just valuable because of its price tag. It was valuable because it represented everything I chose not to take, every shortcut I chose not to use. Sandra called my life's collection junk, but those possessions told the story of a man who gave everything for his family and never asked for anything in return. The tools I'd used to build Michael's first treehouse, the radio I'd fixed and given to Martha for our anniversary, the medals my father earned storming the beaches of Normandy. None of it was junk. All of it was love, sacrifice, and decades of putting others before myself. And now it was gone, thrown away by someone who never understood its real value. Over the following weeks, I watched in horror as Sandra systematically rewrote the story of who I was. What started as casual comments at the barbecue evolved into a full-scale campaign to redefine my entire identity within our family and community. It began with small changes in how she spoke about me. Instead of Dad or Robert, I became Poor Dad in every conversation. Poor Dad is having trouble adjusting to the changes. Poor Dad gets confused about where he put things. Poor Dad isn't as sharp as he used to be. Each phrase was delivered with theatrical concern, painting me as a declining old man who needed constant management. The narrative gained momentum during Michael's next family dinner. Sandra had invited her parents, her sister, and even some of our mutual friends. As we sat around the table, she launched into what sounded like a rehearsed presentation about my situation. "I'm really worried about Dad's mental state," she announced, dabbing her eyes with a napkin. "The hoarding was just the tip of the iceberg. He's been showing signs of confusion and memory loss for months now. Yesterday, he spent 20 minutes looking for his reading glasses when they were on top of his head the whole time." I started to protest, but Sandra continued before I could speak. "And the fixation on that little wooden toy he keeps asking about. He's convinced it was some priceless antique, but honestly, it was just a cheap souvenir. The fact that he's obsessing over it to this degree is concerning." Michael nodded along, clearly having been briefed on this version of events. "Sandra's right, Dad. You've been repeating yourself a lot lately. Maybe we should look into getting you evaluated by a doctor." "There's nothing wrong with my mind," I said firmly. "I remember everything perfectly. The figurine I'm asking about was a Japanese netsuke, carved in the early 1800s. My Uncle Harry brought it back from his service in World War II. Sandra exchanged a meaningful look with her sister. "See what I mean? He's created this whole elaborate backstory for a piece of tourist junk. Dad, your Uncle Harry was never in World War II. He was too young. He was born in 1932. The table fell silent. I felt my face flush hot. "No, that's not right. Harry was my father's older brother. He was 23 when he enlisted in 1942. "Dad," Michael said gently, "Uncle Harry was Grandpa's youngest brother. He was only 13 when the war ended. I think you might be mixing up some family stories." I stared at my son in disbelief. How could he not remember his own great-uncle correctly? I'd told Michael stories about Harry's war service dozens of times when he was growing up. We'd visited Harry together, looked at his photos from Japan, listened to his stories about the occupation period. But as I looked around that table, I saw doubt creeping into everyone's faces. Sandra had planted the seed expertly, and now it was growing. My passionate defense of the figurine's value, combined with what she framed as confusion about family history, made me look exactly like what she wanted me to look like, a confused old man living in fantasies. "The deterioration has been gradual," Sandra continued, now addressing the room like a medical professional delivering a diagnosis. "It started with little things, misplacing items and then accusing others of moving them, telling the same stories repeatedly, getting agitated when we try to help him organize his living space. The hoarding behavior was really a symptom of his declining cognitive function." She was brilliant, I had to admit. Every normal behavior of an elderly person became evidence of decline in her narrative. Every time I repeated a cherished family story became proof of memory problems. Every moment of frustration with her interference became a sign of confusion and agitation. "I think what Dad needs," she said, reaching across the table to pat my hand condescendingly, "is professional support. Maybe we should look into assisted living facilities that specialize in memory care, somewhere he'd be safe and properly supervised. The conversation that followed happened around me, not with me. They discussed my needs and options as if I weren't sitting right there. Sandra painted a picture of a man who could no longer be trusted to live independently, who needed constant supervision, who posed a danger to himself through his hoarding tendencies and delusional thinking. By the end of that dinner, she had successfully reframed my entire existence. I wasn't a grieving widower who'd lost precious memories. I wasn't a father whose sacrifices had been dismissed and discarded. I wasn't a man whose most valuable possession had been thrown away without a second thought. I was a burden, a problem to be solved, a confused old man whose memories couldn't be trusted and whose judgment was fatally compromised. The most devastating part was watching Michael believe every word of it. My son, the boy I'd worked myself to exhaustion to put through college, looked at me with the kind of patient concern you'd show to a child who insisted monsters lived under the bed. Sandra had taken more than my belongings when she cleared out that room. She'd taken my credibility, my dignity, and my voice in my own family's story, and she'd done it so skillfully that everyone thought she was being compassionate. After that dinner, something fundamental changed inside me. I realized that fighting Sandra's narrative head-on was exactly what she wanted. Every protest, every correction, every passionate defense of my memory and judgment only fed into her story that I was becoming increasingly agitated and confused. She had turned my own words into weapons against me. So I stopped talking. Not entirely, of course. I still participated in basic conversations, answered direct questions, maintained the surface courtesies that family life required. But I stopped defending myself. I stopped correcting her lies. I stopped trying to convince anyone that my memories were accurate or that my concerns were valid. Instead, I began to watch and listen with the patience of a man who had finally understood the game being played against him. The change was subtle at first, but I could see it confused Sandra. She had grown accustomed to my reactions, counting on my frustration to validate her narrative. When I stopped providing that frustration, she had to work harder to maintain the story she'd created. "Dad seems to be having more good days lately," she announced to Michael one evening when I was supposedly out of earshot. The medication might be helping. Medication, that was new. I made a mental note to find out what prescription she was referring to, though I suspected it was entirely fictional, another layer to the story of my supposed decline. I spent those quiet weeks doing something Sandra never expected. I began to research. Not loudly, not obviously, but with the systematic determination of a man who had worked with precision machinery for 40 years. Every morning, after Michael left for work and Sandra went to her yoga class, I walked to the public library and used their computers. I researched everything: the value of authentic Edo period netsuke carvings, the legal requirements for disposing of someone else's property, the symptoms of dementia versus normal aging, the process of having someone declared mentally incompetent. I read about elder abuse, financial exploitation, and the legal protections available to seniors whose families sought to control their assets. Most importantly, I researched Sandra herself. What I discovered was illuminating. Sandra Marie Peterson, age 34, had a history that Michael apparently never knew about. Before she became the picture-perfect daughter-in-law, she'd been involved in 2 previous relationships that had ended badly. In both cases, court records showed disputes over property and accusations of financial manipulation. Nothing had been proven, no charges filed, but the pattern was there for anyone willing to look. I also discovered that Sandra had been making inquiries about my financial situation. My bank statements, which I'd always kept private, had been accessed 3 times in the past month using my online banking credentials. Someone had been very thorough in documenting my savings, my social security income, and the equity in my home. Someone who knew that a confused old man living alone in a valuable property might need to be protected from his own poor judgment. The picture became clearer with each piece of information I gathered. This wasn't just about throwing away my belongings. This was about positioning herself as my caretaker and guardian, someone who could make decisions about my property and finances for my own good. The narrative of my declining mental capacity wasn't cruel coincidence, it was careful preparation for a much larger theft. During this period of strategic silence, I also began to observe how Sandra behaved when she thought no one was paying attention. I watched her search through my mail before I could see it. I noticed how she redirected conversations whenever anyone mentioned my past accomplishments or the stories I used to tell about Uncle Harry. I saw her coaching Michael on how to respond to my episodes of confusion, episodes that somehow only occurred when she was around to witness them. Most tellingly, I caught her on the phone with someone, speaking in hushed tones about the timeline and getting everything documented properly. When she saw me, she quickly ended the call and claimed she'd been talking to her mother about recipes. My silence also allowed me to reconnect with parts of my life that Sandra had gradually isolated me from. Old friends who'd stopped calling because Sandra always answered the phone and told them I was having a difficult day. Neighbors who'd been told I was too fragile for social visits. My brother Frank, who lived 2 states away and had been informed that I was going through some memory issues and might not recognize him if he called. When I quietly reached out to these people, I discovered that Sandra had been managing my social life for months, creating a carefully controlled environment where only her version of my story could be heard. She'd been so thorough in her isolation campaign that most people in my life had already accepted that I was declining before they ever witnessed any evidence of it themselves. But the most valuable thing my silence gave me was time to plan. Because as I sat in that empty workshop each evening watching Sandra play her games and manipulate my son, I began to formulate a response that would be far more devastating than any argument I could have made in the heat of the moment. The old Robert would have fought back immediately, with passion and righteous anger. But the new Robert, the strategically silent Robert, was going to fight back with documentation, evidence, and the kind of methodical precision that comes from understanding exactly what kind of war you're really fighting. My years as a machinist had taught me that the most complex problems could be solved by breaking them down into their component parts and addressing each piece systematically. Sandra's campaign against me was no different. It was a machine designed to strip me of my independence, my assets, and my dignity. But every machine has vulnerabilities, and I was going to find every single one of them. The first piece of evidence I secured was the easiest but most crucial, proof of the netsuke's authenticity and value. I drove to the city and found the same antique appraiser who had evaluated it for me back in 1987. Harold Brennan was in his 80s now, but his memory and expertise were as sharp as ever. "Robert," he said, pulling out a thick file cabinet, "I remember that piece vividly. Extraordinary craftsmanship. I still have the photographs and documentation from the original appraisal." He handed me a folder containing detailed photos of the netsuke from every angle, along with his professional assessment certifying its authenticity and current market value of approximately $900,000. "Harold," I said carefully, "if someone threw this away without knowing its value, would there be any legal recourse?" His eyes widened. "Good Lord, Robert, please tell me you still have that piece." When I explained what had happened, Harold immediately offered to serve as an expert witness if needed. "What your daughter-in-law did constitutes destruction of property worth nearly $1 million. Whether she knew its value or not, she had no legal right to dispose of your personal belongings." The second piece of my evidence puzzle came from an unexpected source. My neighbor, Mrs. Chen, had been working in her garden the morning Sandra organized the cleanup of my workshop. She'd seen the entire operation and, more importantly, she'd taken photos. "I thought it was strange," Mrs. Chen explained as she showed me the pictures on her phone. "Sandra kept directing Michael to throw things away so quickly, like she didn't want him to look too closely at anything. And when I saw some of your beautiful collectibles going in the trash, I almost came over to stop them, but then I thought it wasn't my place to interfere with family business." The photos were damning. They showed Sandra literally snatching items from Michael's hands and throwing them directly into the truck bed, not allowing him to examine anything. One photo clearly captured her grabbing a small wooden object, glancing at it dismissively, and tossing it into the pile of junk. Mrs. Chen agreed to transfer all the photos to me and provide a written statement about what she had witnessed that day. The third component of my evidence gathering focused on Sandra's financial activities. I contacted my bank and discovered something that made my blood run cold. Sandra had not only accessed my online banking information, she had also inquired about adding herself as a joint account holder to help manage Dad's finances during his declining years. The bank had required my presence for such a change, which is why it hadn't happened yet. But the attempted manipulation was documented in their system. I immediately changed all my passwords and PINs, then requested copies of every access log for the past 6 months. The pattern showed systematic monitoring of my accounts, always during hours when I was supposedly napping or out of the house. My next step was perhaps the most painful but necessary. I hired a private investigator to look into Sandra's background more thoroughly than my library research had allowed. What Patricia Williams uncovered exceeded even my darkest suspicions. Sandra had been married once before, to a 70-year-old widower named Gerald Morrison. Within 2 years of that marriage, Gerald had been moved into a memory care facility after being declared mentally incompetent. His adult children from his first marriage had contested the competency ruling, claiming Sandra had systematically isolated their father and fabricated evidence of his declining mental state. The case had been settled out of court, with Sandra receiving a substantial portion of Gerald's estate. "The parallels to your situation are remarkable," Patricia explained. "Same pattern of isolating the victim from family and friends, same claims about hoarding and cognitive decline, same gradual assumption of control over finances and living arrangements." Patricia also discovered that Sandra had been in contact with elder care solutions, a company that specialized in transitioning seniors into assisted living facilities. Phone records showed multiple calls between Sandra and their intake coordinator over the past month. The final piece of my evidence collection came from an unlikely source, Michael himself. During one of his visits, I noticed he seemed troubled about something. When I asked him directly if everything was okay, he hesitated before speaking. "Dad, I've been thinking about some of the things Sandra said about Uncle Harry," he said quietly. "I went up to the attic and found some of your old photo albums. There are pictures of you and Uncle Harry at his VFW meetings, and he's wearing his World War II veteran's cap. And I found his discharge papers from 1945. He really was in the Pacific Theater, wasn't he?" I nodded, saying nothing, letting Michael work through the implications on his own. "But Sandra was so certain he was too young for the war," he continued, confusion evident in his voice. "She seemed so sure about the family history. How could she have gotten something so basic so wrong?" I still remained silent, but I saw something shift in Michael's eyes, a crack in the foundation of trust Sandra had built, and that crack was going to be the key to bringing down everything she had constructed. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning while Sandra was at her yoga class. The voice on the other end was one I hadn't heard in nearly 15 years, but I recognized it immediately. "Robert? This is Frank Yamamoto. I hope you remember me." Of course I remembered Frank. He'd been my closest friend during my years working at Patterson Manufacturing. The kind of friendship forged through shared midnight shifts and mutual respect for honest work. Frank had retired to Arizona in 2010, just before Martha passed away, and we'd gradually lost touch as life carried us in different directions. "Frank," I said, genuinely happy to hear his voice. "How did you get my number?" "That's a long story," he replied. "I've been trying to reach you for months, but every time I called, your daughter-in-law told me you were either sleeping, sick, or having memory problems. She suggested I stop calling because it was too confusing for you, but something about her tone never sat right with me." My heart started pounding. "What made you call today?" "I ran into Jimmy Patterson at a trade show in Phoenix last week. You remember Jimmy, the foreman's son? He told me the most interesting story. Said his father kept some old employee files when the plant closed, including documentation about that Japanese artifact you inherited from your uncle. Apparently Jimmy's dad had helped you get it appraised back in the 80s when you were worried about insurance coverage." I gripped the phone tighter. "Someone else knew about the netsuke," Frank continued. "Jimmy said his dad always wondered what happened to that piece, whether you ever realized how valuable it was. When I told him about your daughter-in-law claiming you were having memory issues, Jimmy got concerned. He said a man sharp enough to work precision machinery for 30 years doesn't just lose his mind overnight." This was the validation I hadn't realized I desperately needed. Someone from my past, someone who knew me when I was strong and capable, was questioning the narrative Sandra had created. "Frank, I need to tell you what's been happening here," I said, and for the next hour I laid out everything. Sandra's disposal of my belongings, her claims about my mental decline, her systematic isolation of me from friends and family, even her attempts to access my financial accounts. When I finished, Frank was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something that changed everything. "Robert, I'm flying out there this weekend, and I'm bringing some people with me." "What people?" "People who know you, who remember what kind of man you are. Jimmy Patterson wants to come, and so does Mary Rodriguez from the credit union. Remember Mary? She processed your loan applications for years, including those refinances when Martha was sick. She said any man who worked as hard as you did to pay for his wife's treatment deserves better than being called senile by some gold digger." The word hit me like a physical blow. Gold digger. I'd been so focused on defending my mental capacity that I hadn't fully processed the financial motivations behind Sandra's campaign. But Frank, looking at the situation from the outside, saw it immediately. "There's something else," Frank continued. "I've been doing some research of my own since Jimmy told me about this. Did you know your daughter-in-law was involved in a similar situation with her previous husband? Man named Gerald Morrison?" "I found that too," I admitted. "Well, I found something you might not have discovered yet. Gerald Morrison's daughter lives in Tucson now, about 40 miles from me. Her name is Rebecca Morrison Hall, and she's been trying to find other families who've dealt with Sandra's manipulation. Apparently, there are legal ways to challenge what happened to her father, but she needs corroborating evidence from other victims." My hands were shaking now, but not from age or infirmity. They were shaking with the realization that I wasn't alone, that I wasn't the first, and that someone was building a case against Sandra that went far beyond my stolen netsuke. "Rebecca wants to talk to you," Frank said. "She's actually a lawyer now, specializes in elder abuse cases. She said what Sandra did to you, disposing of your property without permission, attempting to access your finances, isolating you from support systems, it's textbook financial elder abuse." When Frank arrived that weekend, he didn't come alone. Jimmy Patterson looked older but still had the sharp eyes of a man who'd spent his career evaluating people and situations. Mary Rodriguez brought flowers and homemade cookies, treating me exactly the way she had 20 years ago, like a respected customer and friend, not a confused burden. But the most important person Frank brought was Rebecca Morrison Hall. She was a woman in her 40s with her father's kind eyes and a steel determination that reminded me of Martha at her strongest. "Mr. Wilson," she said, shaking my hand firmly. "My father died 2 years ago in that memory care facility, still asking about his collection of antique trains that Sandra claimed were worthless toys. He never understood why his family had abandoned him, because Sandra convinced everyone he was too far gone to have visitors." She opened her briefcase and pulled out a thick folder. "I've been building a case against Sandra for 3 years now. What she did to you, the pattern of behavior, the financial manipulation, it's all part of a systematic operation, and with your evidence and your witnesses, I think we finally have enough to stop her." For the first time in months I felt like the man I used to be, not a victim, not a burden, but someone worth fighting for and fighting with. The confrontation came on a Sunday afternoon, exactly 6 weeks after Sandra had thrown away my life. I had chosen the timing carefully, waiting for Michael's birthday dinner when Sandra would be performing her role as the perfect daughter-in-law for our extended family and friends. Rebecca Morrison Hall sat in my living room, her briefcase open on the coffee table, legal documents spread across the surface like a battle plan. Frank and Jimmy flanked me on either side, their presence a reminder that I wasn't the isolated, confused old man Sandra had painted me to be. When Sandra and Michael arrived, Sandra's face immediately shifted from her practiced smile to barely concealed irritation. She hadn't expected an audience, especially not one that included strangers in business attire. "Dad," Michael said hesitantly, "we weren't expecting other guests today." "Michael," I said, standing up with more confidence than I'd felt in months, "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Morrison Hall. She's an attorney specializing in elder abuse cases. She has some questions about the property that was disposed of from my workshop." Sandra's face went pale, but she recovered quickly. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand why we need lawyers involved in a simple family matter." "Dad, you're confusing everyone with these stories about valuable antiques." Rebecca stood and extended her hand to Sandra. "Miss Peterson, I represent the estate of Gerald Morrison. I believe you were married to Mr. Morrison from 2019 to 2021. The room went dead silent. Sandra's hand trembled slightly as she shook Rebecca's hand, but her voice remained steady. "I'm Sandra Wilson now. Gerald and I divorced before his condition deteriorated. I don't see how that's relevant to anything happening here." "It's relevant," Rebecca said calmly, "because the pattern of behavior you exhibited with Mr. Morrison is identical to what you've been doing to Mr. Wilson here. Systematic isolation from family and friends, claims of cognitive decline that couldn't be medically verified, disposal of valuable personal property, and attempted financial manipulation." Michael looked confused. "Wait, Sandra, you told me your ex-husband died of natural causes. You never mentioned a divorce or any legal issues." Sandra's composure cracked slightly. "It was a complicated situation, Michael. Gerald's children never accepted our relationship. They made false accusations when he needed care. False accusations that were later substantiated by forensic accountants," Rebecca interjected, pulling a document from her briefcase. "Miss Peterson, you received a settlement of $240,000 from Mr. Morrison's estate after his death, despite the fact that he had changed his will 3 months before dying, specifically to exclude you." Frank stepped forward, holding a manila envelope. "Sandra, I think you should also see this." He pulled out the photographs Mrs. Chen had taken of the disposal day, along with Harold Brennan's appraisal documentation. "These photos show you personally throwing away a Japanese netsuke worth approximately $900,000, Frank continued. "The appraiser who originally evaluated this piece in 1987 has provided sworn testimony about its authenticity and value." Sandra stared at the photos, her face cycling through emotions I'd never seen before. Shock, calculation, and finally desperate anger. "This is ridiculous. You can't prove that little wooden thing was worth anything. You're all ganging up on a confused old man's fantasies." That's when Michael spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. "Sandra, I found Uncle Harry's war records. You told everyone he was too young to serve in World War II, but his discharge papers show he enlisted in 1942 and served in the Pacific Theater until 1945. You were completely wrong about basic family history." Sandra whirled to face Michael. "Your father must have confused you with stories. Old people mix up details all the time." "No," Michael said, standing up. "Dad's memory is fine. I've been watching and he remembers everything perfectly. It's you who's been lying." He turned to me, his eyes filled with shame and regret. "Dad, I'm so sorry. I should have listened to you." Sandra realized she was cornered. Her voice rose to a near shout. This is insane. You're all believing the delusions of a senile old man over someone who's been trying to help him." Rebecca calmly placed another document on the table. "Miss Peterson, this is a cease and desist order prohibiting you from accessing Mr. Wilson's financial accounts, entering his property without permission, or making any medical decisions on his behalf. You have 24 hours to return any keys, passwords, or documents you've obtained illegally. And Sandra," I said, my voice steady and strong, "you have 72 hours to find and return my netsuke, or compensate me for its full appraised value, $900,000. For the first time since I'd known her, Sandra had nothing to say. The silence in the room was deafening. I watched as the reality of what had just been revealed washed over my family like a cold wave. Michael stood frozen, his face cycling through disbelief, understanding, and finally horror. His wife, the woman he'd trusted to care for his aging father, had been systematically manipulating and stealing from me for months. Sandra's parents, who had been quietly observing from the corner, looked mortified. Her father, a retired accountant named Dave Peterson, spoke first, his voice barely above a whisper. "Sandra, please tell me this isn't true. Please tell me you didn't steal from this man." Sandra's composure finally shattered completely. "I didn't steal anything," she screamed. "It was junk. All of it was worthless junk. How was I supposed to know that some random piece of wood was worth money? This is all a setup to make me look bad." Her sister Jennifer, who had been one of Sandra's biggest supporters during the Poor Dad Needs Help campaign, stood up abruptly. "Sandra, they have photographs, they have bank records, they have documentation from your previous marriage." She turned to Michael with tears in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Michael. I believed her when she said your father was having problems. We all did." Michael was staring at Sandra like he was seeing her for the first time. "You went through his bank accounts," he said slowly, processing each revelation. "You tried to add yourself as a joint account holder. You were planning to have him declared incompetent." His voice grew stronger with each realization. "This whole thing, the memory care facility comments, the medication you claimed he was taking, it was all lies. Michael, you have to understand," Sandra pleaded, switching to the manipulative tone she'd perfected. "Your father was declining. I was trying to protect him from making poor financial decisions. I was trying to protect you from having to deal with his problems later." Rebecca Morrison Hall interjected calmly. "Miss Peterson, financial exploitation of seniors is a felony in this state. Disposing of someone else's property without permission is theft, regardless of whether you knew its value. Attempting to have someone falsely declared incompetent for financial gain is fraud." Frank stepped forward with another document. "Michael, there's something else you need to know. We found records showing Sandra had been in contact with Elder Care Solutions. She had already scheduled an intake appointment for your father next month. She was planning to have him moved into assisted living within 6 weeks. The color drained from Michael's face. "You were going to put him in a home, without even discussing it with me." Sandra's desperation was now fully visible. "It was going to be a surprise. I was handling all the arrangements so you wouldn't have to worry about the difficult decisions. I was protecting both of you." "Protecting us?" Michael's voice cracked with emotion. "You threw away his Purple Heart. You threw away Mom's jewelry. You threw away a piece worth nearly $1 million. How is destroying his entire life protecting anyone?" Sandra's mother, who had been silent until now, stood up with tears streaming down her face. "Sandra Marie Peterson, what have you done? This man lost his wife, and you took away everything that reminded him of her. How could you be so cruel?" "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," Sandra sobbed, her careful facade completely crumbling. "The appraiser at the estate sale said most old collectibles weren't worth anything. I was just trying to help him move forward with his life. I never meant for this to happen." Jimmy Patterson, who had been quietly observing, spoke up. "Sandra, what estate sale? You told everyone you took everything to the dump." The room went silent again as Sandra realized she'd just admitted to lying about where my belongings had gone. Her face went white as she understood the implications of what she'd just revealed. Michael's voice was deadly quiet. "You sold his things. You didn't throw them away. You sold them. You've been lying about everything, haven't you?" Rebecca immediately pulled out her phone. "I'm calling the police. If items were sold rather than discarded, we may be able to trace them and potentially recover some of Mr. Wilson's belongings." Sandra's father buried his face in his hands. 40 years I've been married to your mother, Sandra, and never once did I think I'd raised a thief. Never once did I imagine my daughter would steal from an elderly widower." Michael turned to me, his eyes filled with shame and regret so deep it was painful to witness. "Dad, I failed you. I failed Mom's memory. I let this woman convince me that you were the problem when she was destroying your life piece by piece." He walked over to Sandra, his movements deliberate and controlled. "We're done, Sandra. Pack your things and get out of my house. I don't want to see you again." "Michael, please," Sandra begged. "You can't believe them over me. I'm your wife. We have a life together. This is all a misunderstanding. But Michael had already turned away from her, walking over to where I sat. He knelt down beside my chair, tears flowing freely down his face. "Dad, can you ever forgive me? I chose her over you, and she was robbing you blind while I watched." I put my hand on his shoulder, feeling like a father again for the first time in months. "Son, she fooled a lot of people. What matters now is that you see the truth." As Sandra continued to plead and make excuses, I realized that the family I thought I'd lost was still there, just buried under layers of manipulation and lies. And now that the truth was finally exposed, we could begin to rebuild what she had tried so hard to destroy. Word traveled fast in our neighborhood. Within 24 hours of the confrontation, the carefully constructed narrative Sandra had built around my supposed decline began crumbling in spectacular fashion. What started as whispered conversations over backyard fences became a full community awakening to the truth about what had really been happening. The first crack in Sandra's public facade came from an unexpected source. Mrs. Patterson from 3 doors down. She had been one of Sandra's most vocal supporters, often praising her dedication to caring for poor confused Robert. But Tuesday morning she knocked on my door with tears in her eyes and a casserole dish in her hands. "Robert, I owe you the biggest apology of my life," she said, her voice shaking. "My daughter Jennifer works at First National Bank downtown. She told me about the alerts they had to put on your account because someone was trying to add themselves as a joint holder. When I heard it was Sandra, everything clicked into place." Mrs. Patterson set the casserole on my kitchen counter and turned to face me directly. "I've been telling people for months that you were getting forgetful and needed help. I feel sick about it now. You were never confused, were you? She was making it all up." "It's not your fault, Helen," I said gently. She was very convincing. "Well, I'm going to make sure everyone knows the truth," she replied with determination. "Starting with the ladies at church. We meet for coffee every Wednesday morning, and Sandra's lies are going to stop spreading right there." Helen kept her word. By Wednesday afternoon, the church coffee group had transformed from Sandra's character witnesses into my advocates. These women, who had influence throughout our community, began systematically correcting the false narrative Sandra had spread. The shift became public in a dramatic way on Thursday evening. Our neighborhood association was holding its monthly meeting, and Sandra had apparently decided to make one last attempt to control the story. She showed up alone, since Michael was no longer speaking to her, and tried to address the growing rumors. "I want to clear up some misunderstandings about my father-in-law," Sandra announced to the gathered neighbors. "There have been some false accusations made about me, and I think it's important that you all know the truth about Robert's condition." That's when Frank Yamamoto stood up. He'd decided to stay in town for a few extra days specifically for this moment. "I think the community deserves to hear from someone who's known Robert Wilson for 30 years, he said firmly. "Someone who worked alongside him when he was operating million-dollar precision machinery that required absolute mental clarity." Frank addressed the room with the authority of someone who had supervised complex industrial operations. "I've seen men with dementia try to work with dangerous equipment. Robert Wilson, at 72 years old, has the same sharp mind and steady hands he had at 42. Anyone claiming otherwise is either mistaken or lying." Sandra tried to interrupt, but Harold Brennan, the antique appraiser, had also chosen this moment to make a public statement. At 84, Harold commanded respect in our community as someone who'd been evaluating valuable items for decades. "I've been in this business for 60 years, Harold announced, standing with the help of his walking stick. "The Japanese netsuke that Sandra Peterson disposed of is worth nearly $1 million. I have the documentation to prove it. What she did wasn't spring cleaning, it was the destruction of an irreplaceable cultural artifact." The room erupted in shocked murmurs. Sandra's face went bright red as she realized that 2 respected men in their 80s were publicly contradicting her narrative about confused elderly people. Mrs. Chen, my neighbor who had photographed the disposal day, stood up next. "I have pictures of Sandra throwing valuable items in the trash," she announced. "I watched her grab things from Michael's hands and throw them away before he could examine them. She knew exactly what she was doing." One by one, people who had supported Sandra began asking uncomfortable questions. Why had she isolated me from longtime friends? Why had she discouraged visitors by claiming I was having a bad day? Why had she been so quick to suggest memory care facilities when no doctor had diagnosed any cognitive problems? The final blow to Sandra's credibility came from Dr. Martinez, my longtime physician, who happened to be present at the meeting. "I've been Robert Wilson's doctor for 15 years, he said clearly. "He has never shown any signs of dementia or cognitive decline. His last comprehensive physical just 3 months ago showed him to be in excellent mental health for his age." Sandra left that meeting in humiliated silence, but the damage to her reputation was just beginning. By Friday morning, the story had spread beyond our neighborhood. Local news picked up the story of the $1 million mistake, focusing on the valuable netsuke that had been thrown away by an ignorant daughter-in-law. The community that had once pitied me as a confused old man now saw me as the victim of a calculated scheme. People who had avoided me because Sandra said I was difficult began stopping by to check on me and offer support. The narrative had completely flipped, and Sandra found herself isolated and discredited in the very community where she'd once been praised as a devoted caregiver. The transformation was remarkable. Within a week of the truth coming out, I went from being the confused old man who needed management to being the respected elder who commanded attention when he spoke. The shift in how people treated me was so dramatic it was almost surreal, but I wasn't about to waste this newfound position of strength. My first move was to reclaim control of my own narrative. I called a meeting at my house, inviting not just Michael and our immediate family, but also the neighbors who had been fed Sandra's lies, the church group that had pitied me, and anyone else who wanted to hear the real story directly from me. I stood in my living room, looking out at faces that had regarded me with patronizing sympathy just weeks before, and I spoke with the authority of a man who had earned everything he possessed through honest work and sacrifice. Many of you heard Sandra claim that I was declining mentally. I began, my voice strong and clear. You heard her say that my possessions were worthless junk that needed to be cleared out for my own good. You heard her suggest that I needed professional care because I couldn't take care of myself. I paused, letting the weight of those false claims settle in the room. I want you to understand what really happened here. Sandra Peterson systematically isolated me from friends and family. She disposed of property worth nearly $1 million without permission. She attempted to gain illegal access to my financial accounts. She began arrangements to have me placed in a memory care facility against my will. This wasn't a daughter-in-law trying to help her confused father-in-law. This was a calculated scheme to steal my independence, my assets, and my dignity. The room was completely silent. These were the same people who had nodded sympathetically when Sandra described my episodes and my hoarding behavior. Now they were hearing the other side of the story from a man who was clearly sharp, articulate, and in complete control of his faculties. Rebecca Morrison Hall stood up next to me. What Mr. Wilson experienced is called financial elder abuse, and it's more common than most people realize. Predators like Sandra Peterson specifically target widowed seniors who have assets but may be socially isolated. They build trust within families and communities while systematically working to gain control over their victims' lives and resources. Frank added his perspective as someone who had known me for decades. I worked with Robert for 20 years. I've seen him troubleshoot complex mechanical problems under extreme pressure. I've seen him manage budgets, supervise crews, and make critical decisions that affected millions of dollars in equipment. The idea that this man suddenly became incompetent at age 72 is not just wrong, it's offensive. Then I revealed something that shocked even Michael. I want everyone to understand exactly how calculated Sandra's behavior was. She wasn't just throwing away random items. She was specifically targeting the most valuable pieces in my collection while making sure Michael didn't have time to examine anything carefully. I pulled out Mrs. Chen's photographs, now blown up to poster size, showing Sandra grabbing items and throwing them away with deliberate haste. These photos show her literally snatching things from Michael's hands. She knew that if he looked closely at any of these items, he might question whether they were really worthless. Dr. Martinez, who had attended to provide medical credibility, addressed the room. I want to be absolutely clear about Mr. Wilson's mental state. He has undergone comprehensive cognitive testing as recently as last month. His memory, judgment, and decision-making abilities are all within normal ranges for his age. Any claims to the contrary are medically unfounded. The power dynamic in the room was now completely reversed. Instead of being the subject of concerned whispers, I was the authoritative voice explaining a complex situation to an audience that hung on every word. Michael stood up, his face still carrying the weight of guilt and shame. I want everyone here to understand how completely Sandra fooled me, he said, his voice breaking slightly. She convinced me that my father, the man who worked himself to exhaustion to pay for my education, the man who sacrificed everything for our family, was becoming a burden. I believed her lies, and I participated in isolating him from the people who cared about him. He turned to address me directly. Dad, I don't know if I can ever make up for what I allowed to happen, but I want everyone here to know that you have my complete support moving forward. Whatever legal action we need to take, whatever resources we need to recover your stolen property, I'm with you. Mrs. Patterson, who had been one of Sandra's strongest supporters, stood up with tears in her eyes. Robert, I spread Sandra's lies to half the church congregation. I told people you were getting confused and needed patience. I want to publicly apologize and ask how I can help set the record straight. One by one, the people who had been manipulated by Sandra began offering their support. Not the patronizing offers of help for a declining old man, but genuine respect for someone who had been wronged and was fighting back. By the end of that meeting, I wasn't just the victim of Sandra's scheme anymore. I was the leader of a community effort to expose what had happened and ensure it never happened to anyone else. The power that Sandra had systematically stripped away from me was not only restored but amplified by the righteous anger of people who realized they had been manipulated into participating in my victimization. For the first time since Martha died, I felt truly powerful again. The desperate phone calls started 3 days after my community meeting. Sandra had moved in with her sister temporarily after Michael kicked her out, and the reality of her situation was apparently beginning to sink in. The first call came at 6 in the morning, waking me from the deepest sleep I'd enjoyed in months. "Dad," Sandra's voice was shaky, stripped of its usual confidence. "Please, we need to talk. I think there's been a terrible misunderstanding about everything that happened." I let her speak, saying nothing, applying the same strategic silence that had served me so well during her campaign against me. "I never meant for any of this to happen," she continued, her words tumbling out in a rush. "I was just trying to help you transition into a simpler lifestyle. I had no idea that any of those old things were valuable. You have to believe me, I would never intentionally throw away something worth money." Still, I remained silent. "Dad, are you there? Please say something. Michael won't take my calls. His lawyer sent me papers about divorce proceedings, and he's demanding I return property I supposedly stole, but I didn't steal anything. How could I steal something when I didn't know it was valuable?" Finally, I spoke. "Sandra, ignorance isn't a legal defense for disposing of someone else's property without permission." "But we're family," she cried. "I was just trying to help. Can't we work this out between us without involving lawyers and police? I'll pay you back for whatever you think the items were worth. We can make this right." Her offer revealed everything. If she could pay me back, it meant she had access to significant money that likely came from selling my belongings rather than throwing them away, just as she'd accidentally admitted during the confrontation. "How much can you pay?" I asked simply. "Well, maybe we could work out a payment plan. I could probably manage a few $1,000s over time." A few $1,000s, for property worth nearly $1 million. Her desperation was showing, but so was her continued dishonesty. The second call came from Sandra's mother, Margaret Peterson. This conversation was even more revealing than Sandra's pathetic attempt at damage control. "Mr. Wilson," Margaret began formally, "I'm calling to apologize for my daughter's behavior, and to see if we can resolve this situation amicably. Sandra is a good girl who made some poor choices, but surely we can find a way to handle this within the family." "Mrs. Peterson," I replied, "your daughter systematically abused an elderly widower and stole property worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. This isn't a family disagreement, it's a crime. Now, Mr. Wilson, let's not be dramatic. Sandra told me she offered to compensate you for any inconvenience. Perhaps we could arrange for a reasonable settlement? Say $10,000? That's more than generous for some old collectibles." The condescension was breathtaking. Even now, even after everything had been exposed, Sandra's family was still trying to minimize what she had done. "Mrs. Peterson, the single most valuable item your daughter threw away was worth more than most people's houses. $10,000 wouldn't cover the cost of my lawyer's retainer, much less compensate me for my losses." There was a long pause before Margaret continued, her tone becoming more desperate. "Mr. Wilson, Sandra has children to think about. If this goes to court, if there are criminal charges, it will destroy her life. Surely you don't want to see innocent children suffer for their mother's mistakes." It was manipulation, pure and simple, the same emotional blackmail Sandra had used, now being deployed by her mother. But I was no longer the isolated, vulnerable target I had been months ago. "Mrs. Peterson, Sandra should have thought about her children before she decided to steal from me. The consequences of her actions are not my responsibility." The third call was the most pathetic of all. It came from Sandra's sister Jennifer, who had actually been present during some of Sandra's character assassination sessions. "Mr. Wilson, I'm calling because I'm worried about Sandra. She's not eating, she's not sleeping, and she keeps saying her life is over. I know she made mistakes, but she's my sister. Is there anything she can do to make this right?" "Jennifer," I said, "your sister didn't make mistakes. She made calculated decisions to exploit and rob me. The only thing that might help her situation is complete honesty about what she did with my belongings and full cooperation with the authorities. She's scared, Mr. Wilson. She's scared she's going to prison." "Maybe if you talk to the prosecutor, explain that she didn't mean any harm. She meant every bit of harm she caused," I replied firmly. "She isolated me from my friends and family. She tried to convince everyone I was mentally incompetent. She attempted to gain control of my finances. She disposed of irreplaceable mementos of my late wife. And she did all of this while smiling and pretending to care about my welfare." The final attempt at manipulation came through Michael. Sandra had apparently convinced someone to contact him, hoping he might intercede on her behalf. When he told me about the conversation, I could see he was struggling with conflicting emotions. "Dad, her cousin called me today. She said Sandra is having panic attacks and can't function. She's begging me to ask you to drop the charges." I looked at my son, this good man who had been so thoroughly deceived by the woman he'd married. "Michael, when your mother was dying of cancer, did Sandra call to check on our family? When I was supposedly declining mentally, did she ever suggest getting me proper medical evaluation? When she was throwing away my belongings, did she ask if any of them might have sentimental value?" Michael's face hardened as he processed my questions. "No, Dad, she didn't do any of those things. Then why should I show her the compassion she never showed me?" The begging and backpedaling revealed exactly what I'd suspected all along. Sandra wasn't sorry for what she'd done to me. She was sorry she'd been caught, and that made my resolve to see justice served even stronger. 2 months after the confrontation, I stood in the doorway of my workshop for what I knew would be the last time in this house. The room looked different now, not because of Sandra's improvements, but because I had systematically removed every trace of her influence from my space. The exercise bike she'd placed as the centerpiece of her wellness room had been donated to the local senior center along with all her motivational posters and yoga equipment. In their place, I'd begun rebuilding my collection, starting with items that friends and neighbors had offered after hearing my story. It wasn't the same as what I'd lost, but it was mine again. Michael knocked on the doorframe behind me. "Dad, the real estate agent will be here in an hour for the final walkthrough. Are you sure about this decision?" I turned to face my son, this man who had rediscovered his integrity and courage over the past few weeks. "I'm sure, Michael. This house has too many ghosts now. Too many memories of being treated like a burden in my own home." We'd made the decision together the week before. The house would be sold, and I would move into a beautiful senior community about 20 minutes away. Not the memory care facility Sandra had researched, but an active adult community, where I could maintain my independence while having access to services if I needed them. But before I closed this chapter of my life, there was one final symbolic act I needed to perform. I walked to the center of the room where Sandra's exercise bike had sat, and placed a small wooden box on the floor. Inside the box were copies of all the legal documents related to Sandra's case: the police reports, the civil lawsuit papers, the restitution orders, and the final judgment that had awarded me $450,000 in damages. It wasn't the full value of what I'd lost. The netsuke itself was gone forever, sold to a private collector who couldn't be traced, but the money represented something more important than financial compensation. It represented acknowledgement, official, legal recognition that what had been done to me was wrong, that my claims weren't the ravings of a confused old man, and that Sandra Peterson was a convicted criminal who had stolen from me. "Dad," Michael said quietly, "I know the money doesn't replace what you really lost." "No," I agreed, "it doesn't, but it proves that I was telling the truth all along. Every time Sandra claimed I was confused, every time she suggested I was imagining things, every time someone looked at me with pity instead of respect, this judgment proves they were wrong." Rebecca Morrison Hall had done her job masterfully. Sandra had ultimately pleaded guilty to elder abuse and grand theft, receiving 2 years in prison and 5 years of probation. More importantly, her conviction had opened the door for other victims to come forward. Gerald Morrison's case was being reopened. 2 other elderly men had contacted Rebecca with similar stories about Sandra's helpful interventions in their lives. I picked up the wooden box and held it for a moment, feeling the weight of justice in my hands. Then I set it on the shelf where my father's Purple Heart had once hung, not as a shrine to my victimization, but as a reminder of my strength in fighting back. "The movers will be here tomorrow morning," Michael said. "Your new place is all set up. Frank even drove down from Arizona to help arrange your workshop space." I smiled at that. Frank had become more than a friend during this ordeal. He'd become family, the kind of family that actually supported you when times got tough, instead of trying to profit from your vulnerability. As we prepared to leave the room, I stopped and took one last look around. This space had seen so much. Decades of tinkering and creating, quiet evenings sorting through collections, the devastating morning when I discovered everything was gone, and finally the meetings where I'd planned my recovery. "Sandra thought she was erasing my past when she emptied this room," I said to Michael. "But she actually gave me something I didn't know I needed." "What's that, Dad?" "Proof that I'm still strong enough to fight for myself. Proof that my mind is sharp enough to outmaneuver someone 40 years younger. Proof that the man who raised you is still here, still capable, still worthy of respect." I reached over and turned off the light switch, plunging the room into darkness for the final time. "She tried to make me disappear," I said as we walked away. "Instead, she reminded me who I really am." The house would sell to a young family who would fill it with new memories and new purpose, but the lessons learned in that empty workshop would stay with me forever. 6 months later, I was settling into my new life at Willowbrook Gardens when the letter arrived. It was addressed in Sandra's handwriting, forwarded from my old address, and for a moment I considered throwing it away unopened. But curiosity won over caution, and I found myself reading what I suspected would be Sandra's final attempt at manipulation. The letter was 3 pages long, filled with carefully crafted phrases that sounded like apology but weren't quite authentic. She wrote about misunderstandings and different perspectives and regrettable outcomes. She mentioned her children and how difficult the divorce and legal proceedings had been for them. She talked about prison being a learning experience that had given her time to reflect on past decisions. But nowhere in those 3 pages did Sandra actually say, "I'm sorry for what I did to you." Nowhere did she acknowledge that she had systematically abused and robbed me. It was a masterpiece of non-apology, designed to sound remorseful while accepting no real responsibility. I set the letter aside and walked out to my small garden, where I'd been growing tomatoes and peppers in raised beds that I'd built myself. Mrs. Henderson from the next unit over was watering her flowers and waved when she saw me. "Robert, you have a visitor," she called out. "A young man in a suit. He's waiting by your front door." I walked back around the building to find a man in his 30s holding a briefcase and looking somewhat nervous. He introduced himself as David Morrison, Gerald Morrison's son and Rebecca's brother. "Mr. Wilson," he said, shaking my hand firmly, "I wanted to meet you in person to thank you for your courage in prosecuting Sandra. Because of your case, we were able to reopen my father's case and recover some of the assets she stole from him." We sat on my small patio, and David told me about his father's final years. How Sandra had convinced everyone that Gerald was becoming paranoid and delusional when he claimed someone was stealing from him. How she'd gradually isolated him from his children, claiming they were upsetting him with their visits. How she'd moved him into progressively more restrictive care facilities while selling off his belongings and transferring his assets to herself. The worst part, David said, his voice heavy with regret, was that we believed her. We actually thought we were protecting Dad by limiting our contact with him. She was so convincing, so concerned, so seemingly devoted to his care. I understood that guilt intimately. "Your father knew you loved him," I said. "That's what matters." "The reason I'm here," David continued, "is that Sandra's conviction in your case gave us the legal grounds to challenge her actions against my father. We recovered almost $200,000 in assets she'd liquidated, plus his collection of model trains that we found in a storage unit she'd rented." David opened his briefcase and pulled out a small wooden object. My heart stopped. It was a netsuke, not the same one Sandra had thrown away, but clearly from the same period and artistic tradition. "This belonged to my father," David said. "It was part of his collection that Sandra tried to sell, but the auction house questioned its provenance when our lawyer intervened. Dad would have wanted you to have it. He always said that good people should look out for each other." I took the small carving in my hands, feeling its weight and examining the intricate details. It was beautiful, depicting a craftsman at work, and I could feel the centuries of history in its smooth surfaces. "David, I can't accept something this valuable," I said. "Mr. Wilson, you gave my family something much more valuable than any artifact. You gave us justice for our father and peace for ourselves. This is a small token of our gratitude." As David prepared to leave, he mentioned something that surprised me. "There's going to be a news story about Sandra's pattern of elder abuse cases. The reporter wants to interview you about your experience, but only if you're comfortable with it." I thought about that for several days. Part of me wanted to maintain my privacy and move forward quietly with my new life, but I also realized that my story might help other families recognize the warning signs of elder abuse before it was too late. The interview aired 3 weeks later on the local evening news. The reporter, a professional woman named Sarah Chen, handled the story with dignity and respect. She interviewed me in my garden, surrounded by the vegetables I'd grown and the peaceful life I'd built for myself. "Mr. Wilson," she asked, "has Sandra Peterson ever apologized for what she did to you?" I held up her letter, which I'd kept as evidence of her continued manipulative behavior. "She sent me a letter recently. It talks about misunderstandings and different perspectives, but it never actually acknowledges what she did or takes responsibility for it. How do you feel about that?" I looked directly into the camera, thinking about other elderly people who might be watching, other families who might be dealing with similar situations. I've learned that some people will never apologize because admitting they were wrong means accepting that they're not the victim in their own story. Sandra still sees herself as someone who was trying to help me, who got caught up in unfortunate circumstances. She'll probably never understand that she was a predator who targeted a grieving widower. I paused, feeling the weight of my words. But I don't need her apology anymore. I have something better. I have my dignity back, my independence restored, and the knowledge that I was strong enough to fight back and win. That's worth more than any apology she could offer. The recognition I'd received, from the legal system, from my community, from other victims' families, had given me something Sandra's manipulation had tried to steal: the certainty that I was worthy of respect and protection. 1 year after moving to Willowbrook Gardens, I stood before a room full of families at the community center, sharing my story as part of an elder abuse prevention workshop. It had become my mission, my new purpose in the chapter of life that Sandra had tried to steal from me. The warning signs aren't always obvious, I told the audience of adult children and their aging parents. Sandra didn't burst into my life waving red flags. She came disguised as a caring daughter-in-law who was concerned about my well-being. She isolated me gradually, discredited me systematically, and nearly succeeded in convincing everyone, including my own son, that I was incompetent. In the front row sat Michael with his girlfriend Ellen, a kind woman who treated me with genuine respect and warmth. Their relationship was still new, but I could see how differently Michael approached this partnership. He'd learned to recognize manipulation and value authenticity. Sandra's betrayal had been devastating, but it had also made him a wiser, more discerning man. After my presentation, a woman in her 50s approached me with tears in her eyes. "Mr. Wilson, I think my stepmother is doing something similar to my father. She's convinced him that we children just want his money, and she's gotten him to change his will. But after hearing your story, I'm wondering if we should be more concerned." These conversations had become common. Since the news story aired, I'd received dozens of calls and emails from families dealing with similar situations. Rebecca Morrison Hall had connected me with a network of elder abuse advocates, and together we'd helped expose 3 other cases of financial exploitation in our county alone. My new workshop at Willowbrook was a source of daily joy. I'd rebuilt my collection slowly, focusing not on value but on meaning. Each piece had a story, often given to me by friends who'd heard about my losses and wanted to contribute to my recovery. The Japanese netsuke David Morrison had given me held the place of honor, reminding me daily that good people do look out for each other. Frank visited regularly, sometimes staying for weeks at a time. We'd become like brothers, bound together by the shared experience of fighting for truth and justice. He'd also become an unofficial grandfather to Michael's new relationship, offering the kind of wisdom that comes from seeing life clearly and speaking honestly. But the most unexpected gift of this new chapter came from an unlikely source. Harold Brennan, the antique appraiser who'd testified about my stolen netsuke, had approached me with a proposition. At 84, he wanted to retire but worried about what would happen to his extensive knowledge of Asian art and artifacts. "Robert," he'd said during one of our weekly coffee meetings, "you have a natural eye for quality and authenticity. You understand the historical context of these pieces better than collectors half your age. Would you consider learning the appraisal business?" At 73, I was embarking on a new career. Harold was teaching me the technical aspects of authentication and valuation, while I brought decades of careful observation and genuine appreciation for craftsmanship. We'd already worked together on several estate evaluations, and I'd discovered a talent for recognizing valuable pieces that others might overlook. The irony wasn't lost on me. Sandra had thrown away my most valuable possession because she couldn't recognize its worth. Now I was training to help other families avoid that same devastating mistake. On quiet evenings, I often sat in my garden with a cup of coffee, reflecting on the strange journey that had brought me to this place. Martha would have been proud of how I'd fought back, but she would have been even prouder of how I'd chosen to use my experience to help others. My phone buzzed with a text message from Michael. "Dad, Ellen and I wanted you to be the first to know. We're engaged. She specifically asked if you would walk her down the aisle alongside her father. She says you're the example of the kind of man she hopes I'll become." I smiled, feeling Martha's presence in the warm evening air. The life Sandra had tried to destroy hadn't just been rebuilt, it had been transformed into something richer and more meaningful than before. The grandfather clock Harold had given me from his personal collection chimed 8 o'clock. Soon I'd go inside to review tomorrow's appraisal appointments and prepare for another elder abuse workshop at the end of the week. I'd started this year as a victim, convinced that my best days were behind me. Now I was ending it as an advocate, a mentor, and a man with a future full of purpose. Sandra had taken my past, but she'd inadvertently given me something more valuable, a mission that would define the rest of my life. The man she'd tried to erase had become stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever before, and that was a legacy worth leaving.